Okay, so these are going so well, and I love talking about this. So we're just going to keep rolling here. This day, we are going to be talking about lessons lessons 3 and 4. So let's get that screen up here. Why can't I find it? I think it's this one. There she is. So the lessons of World War One, every other war, we've already talked about the first two. Today we're going to talk about how leadership matters and the average person matters. Thursday we'll talk about the consequences and people getting hurt. And then I think on Friday we'll do 7 and 8. So let's get right to leadership. This guy, Otto von Bismarck. This guy was a genius when it comes to what we call geopolitics. This idea of playing the game that countries play between allies, and pushing people to the brink and pulling back when it's appropriate, finding the right friends, all of those things. And now I mentioned him earlier this week. Otto von Bismarck was the leader of Germany, the military leader of Germany. He was not the head of Germany. That was the Kaiser, and we'll talk about the Kaiser in a little bit. But certainly, if you want to know a smart man and a guy who kind of understood how the world worked, it was Otto von Bismarck. But like I told you, he worked for a man named Kaiser Wilhelm II, and here he is here. He became the Kaiser. The Kaiser is like the term for king or emperor or whatever, but the Kaiser was the real leader of Germany. Here he is here. He's a young man when he took over, and he wasn't that smart. I don't know if I have. Okay, don't pretend I didn't do that. The Kaiser, though, when he was born, there was difficulty in his childbirth, and so the doctors used like forceps or something to pull him out. And while they did that, they wrenched his arm out of its socket, and so it was useless to him for his whole life. As he was growing up, his parents tried to hide this by making him wear clothes that would make it look like his arm was still had strength in it. They made him work harder physically and train harder. There was one story where they tried to teach him to ride a horse without a saddle, and he kept falling off and falling off and falling off. And he finally learned how to do it, but the person who was teaching him said he would fall off and cry and cry and cry and has to stop and not do this, but then they forced him to keep doing it. And so imagine like living that life of not ever like meeting the expectations of your family and friends or your country. And so he always had this, it seemed like he had this desire to prove to people that he was stronger than maybe what he really was. And this might have been a problem for him as the leader of Germany, as you'll see when the war gets started. Another leader, let's talk about the leaders in Russia. They were the Tsar and the Tsarina, Nicholas and Alexandra. Here they are, Nicholas and Alexandra, and all of their kids. And again, Nicholas becomes the Tsar, the head of Russia, the leader of Russia, not because he really wanted it, but because that's what was supposed to happen. He was the son of the leader and whatever. And so, like, the last thing he wanted to do was to be the leader of Russia, but he's thrown into this role of responsibility. He also had a son. He had a son who was a hemophiliac, which means that his blood didn't clot. And so the smallest cut that his son got, he would bleed and bleed and bleed if they didn't do anything about it. And he loved his son, and he didn't want anything bad to happen to his son. And so one day when this man came along, a guy named Rasputin, and you'll see his picture down here. One thing about Rasputin that um, I think is a theme throughout maybe history is this concept of crazy eyes. And when you look at every picture of Rasputin, he's got these crazy eyes. But he convinced the Tsar that he could cure his son of hemophilia. Of course, he couldn't, but the Tsar was more than happy for him to try. When Rasputin got in close with the family here, he started kind of taking over more and more power, which was fine with the Tsar because he didn't really want to be the Tsar, and if some other guy wanted to do it, then that would be great. But it turns out that old Crazy Eyes Rasputin was in fact a little insane, and they kind of found out that he was and killed him. So that didn't work out too well for the Tsar. But they're just kind of an indication that he really wasn't, he didn't really know what he was doing, and he really didn't want to do it anyways. This is the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, and you can see he is the oldest person of all of these leaders, kind of frail and fragile, and didn't really know what he was doing either. And even when the war begins, he basically does what the Germans want. He's not really a spokesperson for any type of nice conversations, negotiations. When it comes to military leaders, let me tell you about General Joseph Joffre. This is the French military leader. And he was so certain that the way to win World War I was going to be through the use of the bayonet. And you'll see bayonet is a pretty mean weapon, and you see it right here. I mean, I think some people think a bayonet is just a small little knife that goes on the end of a gun, but it's usually long enough that it'll go through a human being. And he also wanted his armies to look good. And you can kind of see in this picture, like they had the red hats and the nice coats. And the idea that he had was that the French army would look so ferocious going into battle that the enemy would just run away. And even if they didn't run away, well, they had bayonets. Well, we know already now that with the rise of militarism throughout Europe, that the Germans had guns like Big Bertha that were dropping 1-ton shells on people. And here's the French leader who was counting on the bayonet as the way to win the war. As an example of his poor leadership or his poor understanding of what was going on, you see this number here. On this one day, the beginning of World War I, the war begins at the end of July, and one of the first battles here is between the French and the Germans. And you'll see on August 22nd, 1914, 27,000 French soldiers were killed on this one day. This is the bloodiest day in French history. He kind of goes down in history as the one who was responsible for that. And I don't think he ever recovered from that. I'm not sure if the French ever recovered from that. Another leader on the Triple Entente side was this British military leader. His name was General Douglas Haig. And this is later in the war, an example of his poor leadership in the Battle of Ypres. You'll see that right here, the Battle of Ypres in Belgium. This was a battle that, you know, he had it almost right. He was going to use all the weapons that he had at the time. By this time, the British were using planes. They had high explosive shells that could be launched from a long ways away. They had the soldiers and some tanks even by this point in time in World War I. He was going to use them all in a coordinated effort here against the Germans in this small little place called Ypres, Belgium. Well, so he had the plan all ready to go, but the attack was going to take place in the summer, which ended up being one of the wettest summers on record. So they got so much rain that it made the ability to fly the planes, they were unable to fly the planes. They were unable to use the tanks. It just wasn't going to work out. But instead of replanning the attack, he just went ahead with the attack that that he had already planned. And I'm not sure what this video is, but let's take a look. And so, and this is just a YouTube video. I'm not sure if I have it linked on Moodle for you to watch in the entirety if you want, but certainly the Battle of Ypres is a great example of this poor leadership. And I forget how many hundreds of thousands of people were killed in this battle. But what became memorable about the Battle of Ypres was not who won, but was that people drowned in mud. And you can see down here in this picture how, like, soldiers, in this case horses, just be walking along and suddenly they would just sink in the mud, and sometimes they would sink to their deaths. I'm not sure there's a worse way to die than that. So this is another example of some poor leadership. And unfortunately, all the leaders we've talked about, except Otto von Bismarck, seem to be poor leaders. And that might be a reason World War I was one of the most horrible moments in human history that existed, because of all the poor leaders taking countries into battle. And so I want you to just take a second to think about all of these leaders in the world today, and what their leadership means. And I don't know if you even know all of these people. Hopefully you know our president, Donald J. Trump, over here. This is the leader of Germany, Angela Merkel. The leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the leader of Iran. I forget his name. This is the king of Jordan. He's a pretty cool guy, but he's still a king. But he's of Jordan, which is on the border of Syria and all those places. This is the leader of ISIS. You know what? He might even be dead by now. Al-Zarqawi. This is the leader of Canada, Justin Trudeau. This is the Prime Minister of England, Theresa May, and the leader of France, Francois Hollande. And so I don't know if you even know all of these people, but the question is, like, what is their leadership style? What are they trying to lead the country and the world to? And certainly they all matter. As the leaders of World War I, the poor leaders of World War I more or less led the countries into horrible things. Let's talk about the average person then. We know that leadership matters, but what about the average person? Well, certainly you can't have an army without average people making up the army, right? So you can have, like, the great general, but if he doesn't have an army, then it's not going to do much good. So they had to raise armies quickly. The British didn't really have an army, and so the one way that they decided to raise an army was come up with some gimmicks. One of the gimmicks was they'd go to, like, soccer stadiums, and they'd stop the game, and they'd go down on the field, and they'd be like, okay, everyone, it's time to sign up. So imagine being a young man at a soccer game, and they're asking for volunteers to fight for your country. Just think of the peer pressure that must have existed, you know, to kind of convince you to go off to war. And certainly the people who were trying to get these young men to sign up for the war knew exactly what they were doing. And they also came up with this scheme called Sign Up With Your Pals. They said, look, if you get a group of your friends together, you can go to war together. And we'll make sure you stay together. So again, that was a way, you know, for friends to get each other to go off to war together. The problem with Sign Up With Your Pals that they'll find up at the end of the war, because most of these battles had, you know, casualty rates in the hundreds of thousands. And so imagine having, like, all your friends from your town sticking together, and they were fighting one battle where suddenly in the course of a few days, all of the young men of certain British towns were killed. I think there was only one town in England who did not have a a person killed in World War One. Others had all of them killed. And so they realized that this was probably a mistake. And the United States makes kind of the same mistake in World War II, and you'll get to that a little bit later. But certainly the average person matters, and these governments try to find ways to trick and peer pressure the average person to supporting the war effort. And I don't know if you know how World War One ends. I mean, it ends because of this, because of mutiny. And it started first amongst French soldiers who realized that there was no reason that they should be fighting. And so whole groups of French soldiers just quit fighting. After the Battle of Ypres with the British in the mud, drowning in the mud, you start to see mutiny along the British ranks. So this idea that soldiers always do what they're told to do, well, it better not always be the case. So if you're an average person, an average soldier, and somebody gives you an order that makes no sense, then maybe hopefully you have the guts and the courage to maybe not follow those orders. And this leads us to this. This is one of the most magical moments, I think, in human history, maybe just in Western human history. This is the Christmas truce in 1914. So I told you the war began in July. By Christmas of that year, so not even 6 months later, there have been over 1 million people killed already in 6 months. And no one could really explain why they were fighting, like what the point was. All of those things we talked about earlier this week had just kind of taken hold. The nationalism, the militarism, the hate, the revenge, all of those things kind of took hold. And then everyone rushed to war, and they didn't really know what they were doing. And millions of people were killed and wounded. And so Christmas comes, and they stop along the Western Front. The British, German, and I think Scottish troops, maybe even some French troops too. They just took a break. And remember, they were ordered to fight and kill each other. But for a few days here around Christmas of 1914, they came out of their trenches. They played soccer. They went to each other's funerals of people both sides had killed. They cleaned up the battlefield. They exchanged food. They did all of these things that normal people do on Christmas. And it was quite lovely. If you want to, you can stop this video now and watch some of these videos that are linked down below. One of these is this one here. It's a better link down below, but it's a TV commercial that was done in England a few years ago to sell some chocolate. But I think it captures what this moment must have been like. There's the longer version of it here, and I love this one too. This is a reaction to this chocolate commercial of people in England just a few years ago who were watching this commercial and the impact that it had on them. But I think so these are just the average people who just decided they weren't going to fight for a few days because they just didn't want to do it anymore. And no matter what top commander came and said you had to do this, it didn't really matter. So they had a good Christmas in 1914. But what's even more strange, when they realized like how nice peace could be, that didn't matter because they went back to killing each other as soon as the Christmas truce was over. But I love this example, and I wish this is. People asking this question, like if you could be someplace in history and see that event in person, which one would it be? This one is near the top of my list, I think. And so I want to ask you about you. I want you to think about you. Like, how do you matter? And whether you realize it or not, you do matter to somebody. And so the actions that you take towards people, even though when we look, if you remember that spectrum of human behavior, sometimes it's a little murky in the middle. No matter what you do, whether it be if you smile to someone or if you don't smile to someone, if you ignore people, whatever you do have an impact on things, on other people. And there's this great commercial that I would love for you to watch. I'm not going to play it for you here. It's linked down below. But it's another commercial from Thailand. But you kind of see like maybe what the impact the average person can have, both on individuals and maybe on the world. So those are lessons 3 and 4. Hopefully you enjoyed those. Please do the assignment then for today, and watch all the videos down below if you want. They're pretty good. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me. But that's good enough for today, and we will see you tomorrow. Thanks.